Imagine waking up one day and realizing that the heaviest chains you carry are not forged from iron, but from your own memories. Not the sweet ones, not the joyful ones, but the ones that ache, the ones that sting, the ones that never seem to let go. Imagine discovering that, in some twisted way, the very pain you swore you wanted to escape has become the one thing you cannot live without. You say you despise heartbreak, betrayal, failure, rejection. Yet why do you replay them in your mind, late at night, over and over, like an addict returning to the needle? Why does the heart curl itself around wounds as if they were treasures? Why, when happiness finally knocks at your door, do you hesitate unsure if you even want to let it in? Could it be that pain is not merely something that happens to us, but something we secretly crave? A hidden companion, a silent addiction dressed in sorrow. Think about it. The happiest day of your life fades quickly, doesn't it? That perfect moment you thought you'd never forget already, it grows faint, diluted in memory. But the moment you were humiliated in front of others, the betrayal of someone you trusted, the failure that cut you down to your knees, those remain vivid, almost alive, as though your mind sharpens them each time they are recalled. Why is it that we remember agony more vividly than joy? Why does suffering stay, while pleasure slips like water through our fingers? Perhaps the cruelest paradox of the human condition is this: you long to heal, yet you cling to what hurts you most. Like a bird with broken wings that refuses to leave its cage, even when the door swings wide open. You whisper that you want freedom, yet secretly, silently, you stroke the bars of your prison, as if afraid of what life without them might mean. Is it possible, terrifying as the thought may be, that we are addicted to our own suffering? That beneath the surface of conscious denial, there lies a darker hunger, one that feeds on sorrow as though it was sustenance. And if that's true, if pain is not only endured, but desired, what does that say about us? About the way our minds are wired, about the architecture of the human soul. Imagine a world where people do not chase pleasure, but chase anguish. Not consciously, of course, that would be too obvious, but unconsciously, instinctively, like moths circling a flame that will burn them. Imagine how this hidden thirst for pain could explain why we stay in toxic relationships long after they've drained us. Why we replay our failures in the theater of our minds. Why we sabotage our own happiness the moment it feels too real. It is easy to dismiss these questions with simple answers. We're just weak. We're traumatized. We haven't healed yet. But what if the truth cuts deeper? What if we aren't merely victims of pain, but collaborators with it? What if the wound becomes an identity, and without it, we feel like nobody? Consider this: when someone asks you who you are, don't you instinctively recall not only your victories, but also your scars? Isn't it the heartbreaks, the betrayals, the humiliations that define your story more sharply than any triumph? If suffering is the ink with which we write our identities, then perhaps losing that suffering feels like losing ourselves. So the question lingers, sharp as glass: do we cling to our pain because we cannot escape it, or because we secretly fear what life would be without it? And if so, then the ultimate paradox emerges. In our desperate attempts to rid ourselves of suffering, we may only be deepening the very addiction we seek to escape. What kind of creature chooses anguish when joy is possible? What does it mean to crave wounds more than healing? And most haunting of all, what becomes of us when we finally realize that our greatest source of comfort might be the very thing that's killing us? You feel the weight of this question pressing in, don't you? The unsettling realization that somewhere inside, you too may be nursing a pain you do not truly wish to let go of. Perhaps you already sense it, that faint unease, that recognition, that quiet whisper reminding you of the wounds you revisit when no one else is watching. This is not a question that can be answered quickly. It is not a puzzle to be solved with logic alone. It requires something deeper, descent into the hidden chambers of the psyche, into the philosophies that dared to confront the shadow of human existence. Because the roots of this addiction are not surface level. They reach into history, into the dark musings of philosophers, into the very way consciousness itself is shaped. So before we speak of freedom, we must first understand the prison. Before we speak of healing, we must ask, why do we worship our wounds? Why does the heart make a shrine out of suffering? And it is here at the threshold of this unsettling truth that the real journey begins. The hidden problem and its psychological, philosophical roots, second section. To understand why we are drawn to emotional pain, we must travel deeper into the labyrinth of the human mind. It is not enough to say we are hurt. We must ask why we return to the wound, why the sting becomes a kind of sanctuary. Carl Jung once wrote that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. What did he mean? Perhaps that we do not simply suffer, we choose the form of our suffering. We mold it into something tolerable, something familiar, something that gives us a sense of meaning. In other words, pain becomes the mask we wear to hide from a greater abyss, the void of not knowing who we are or why we exist. This is where the addiction begins. Pain offers certainty in a world full of uncertainty. When everything else shifts, friends leave, ambitions fail, the future trembles before our suffering remains steady, like an anchor pulling us down. Strange as it sounds, anguish becomes reliable. Happiness is fleeting, fragile. Despair, in contrast, feels strangely durable. Think of Nietzsche, who declared that human beings do not seek pleasure or avoidance of pain, but rather a sense of meaning. And meaning, for many, is found not in joy, but in struggle. If you define yourself by the battles you've endured, then to release those battles is to erase the very story that makes you who you are. So you cling to them, even as they bleed you. But there is another layer, darker still. Our brains are wired in peculiar ways. Neuroscience reveals that the amygdala, the part of the brain that processes fear and pain, has a stronger grip on memory than the regions responsible for joy. Evolution carved this into us. To survive, our ancestors had to remember threats, betrayals, and dangers far more vividly than fleeting pleasures. That genetic inheritance still lives in us. We replay painful experiences not only because they hurt, but because our biology insists they are more important than happiness. To forget suffering, the brain believes, would be to risk death. And yet, psychology shows that beyond survival, there is identity. Pain becomes a mirror in which we recognize ourselves. Schopenhauer once called suffering the essence of life, claiming that existence itself was a cycle of desire and disappointment, where to live is to ache. For him, joy was merely the pause between torments, a brief silence before the music of anguish began again. While bleak, his perspective reveals something vital. Suffering feels authentic. Unlike happiness, which is delicate and fleeting, pain feels raw, real, undeniable. This might explain why so many cling to it. Emotional pain is not just endured, is believed. Happiness can feel like a dream, easily dismissed. Pain feels like truth. But here lies the philosophical trap. Sartre argued that human beings are condemned to freedom, meaning we are forced to choose, forced to define ourselves without a script. That freedom terrifies us. In response, many run back to their suffering. Is familiar. It requires no new choices. To suffer is easier than to be free. Pain tells us who we are, so we need not face the burden of creating ourselves anew. Consider the person who cannot let go of betrayal. The relationship has ended, the wound is years old, yet they revisit it as though it were fresh. Why? Because the betrayal provides a script. I am the one who was wronged. That script gives identity, and identity, however painful, feels safer than the emptiness of the unknown self. The hidden problem is this: suffering offers both identity and meaning. We do not merely feel pain, we live in it, feed on it, sculpt it into the very architecture of the self. To remove it would mean dismantling who we are. And society, knowingly or not, reinforces this addiction. Look at the stories we celebrate. Tragedies etched into novels, heartbreaks sung in music, betrayals immortalized in film. Culture rewards pain with attention, with empathy, with art. The man who says, "I am happy," is met with silence. The man who says, "I am broken," is met with nods, compassion, and validation. Subtly, we learn that our suffering makes us visible, makes us matter. Viktor Frankl, in Man's Search for Meaning, described how even in the horrors of the concentration camps, survival was not about pleasure or even physical endurance, but about finding meaning in suffering. To endure torment with no sense of why was unbearable. But if one could say, this pain serves a purpose, it became survivable. In that light, suffering transforms into a form of spiritual currency, a justification for existence. So we clutch our pain like relics, each scar a sacred proof that we are alive. But in doing so, we feed an endless cycle. Pain births identity. Identity resists healing. Healing threatens the identity, so the wound is preserved. This cycle is not mere weakness. It is a psychological strategy, a defense against the void. But like all strategies, it becomes a trap. Pain protects us from meaninglessness, but imprisons us in misery. It shields us from the terror of freedom, but robs us of the joy that freedom could bring. And here is where the paradox sharpens. To let go of pain feels like death, but to hold on to pain is a slow death in itself. Which death will you choose? The death of the false self, addicted to suffering, or the death of the possibility you never dared to embrace? This is why we cannot dismiss suffering as an unfortunate accident. It is not a surface wound. It is a psychological root system, entangled in memory, identity, culture, and survival. To confront it requires more than comfort. It requires the courage to see how deeply we have loved our own misery. But what happens when we allow this hidden addiction to run unchecked? What are the consequences when pain becomes not just a memory, but a destiny? That is the shadow we must now face. The unseen consequences. Third section. When pain ceases to be a passing storm and becomes the climate of your existence. The consequences seep into every corner of your life, often unnoticed, often disguised as ordinary choices, habits, or patterns. Like a toxin dissolved in clear water, suffering can become so diffused into your daily living that you no longer see it, even as you drink it every day. Think of the moments you've replayed your failures, not once or twice, but dozens, perhaps hundreds of times. Each repetition carves a groove in the brain, a neural pathway reinforced until it becomes a highway. Psychologists call this rumination the endless circling around pain, as if circling a drain. And yet, though it feels involuntary, it carries a secret seduction. The mind whispers, if I replay this again, maybe this time I'll find closure. Maybe this time the past will change. But of course, it never does. Instead, each replay deepens the wound, and the wound begins to shape who you are. The unseen consequence is that pain becomes your compass, pointing the direction of your choices. You hesitate before love because betrayal still lingers like smoke. You shrink from risk because failure once left you bleeding. You distrust joy because you've been taught that every high precedes a devastating fall. Slowly, imperceptibly, suffering doesn't just visit your life, becomes the architect of it. Cognitive psychology reveals how strong this architecture can be. The negativity bias our brain's natural tendency to focus more on painful experiences than positive ones ensures that even in a sea of blessings, the single wound defines the whole. You may receive 10 compliments and 1 insult. Which one plays on repeat in your head? You already know. It is the sting, not the sweetness, that lingers. And so, unknowingly, you sculpt an identity more faithful to sorrow than to joy. But this is not merely internal. Entire societies are built upon this addiction. Look at how economies thrive on dissatisfaction. Advertising whispers to you, you are incomplete, you are lacking, you are not enough. And because you already carry unhealed wounds, those whispers pierce deeply. The culture tells you that consumption can soothe the ache, but the ache never dissolves. The system, like a parasite, thrives precisely because your pain remains unresolved. The philosopher Aldous Huxley once warned that societies could enslave their people not by chains but by manipulating desires and fears. If pain is our default state, then entire industries can capitalize on its pharmaceuticals promising chemical escape, entertainment promising distraction, religions promising salvation. Pain, in this way, becomes a commodity, traded and exploited, while the individual believes they are simply coping. And yet, the greatest consequence lies not in economics, but in the soul. When you are addicted to pain, you do not just avoid happiness, you begin to fear it. Joy becomes suspicious, fleeting, almost dangerous. Have you noticed how difficult it is to sit in genuine peace? How an unexplainable anxiety creeps in when life feels too quiet, too good? That is not coincidence. That is the conditioning of suffering. The nervous system, so accustomed to anguish, does not trust joy. It anticipates collapse, loss, betrayal. So you sabotage it. You push away the very thing you claim to long for, because somewhere inside, pain feels safer. This is perhaps the most haunting truth. Pain can masquerade as comfort. The toxic relationship you refuse to leave, the job that crushes your spirit but pays the bills, the friendships that drain you yet feel familiar, all of these are shrines to your addiction. You stay, not because it is good, but because it is known. The unknown, even if it promises freedom, terrifies more than the cage you've decorated with familiar wounds. Neuroscience again confirms this. The brain rewards familiarity, even when familiarity is harmful. Dopamine does not only spike with pleasure, it spikes with prediction. To repeat a painful pattern is to affirm the brain's model of the world. Paradoxically, suffering feels right because it confirms what you already believe, that the world is cruel, that you are unworthy, that happiness is a fragile illusion. So you live in a self-fulfilling prophecy. You expect pain, and so you interpret life through its lens. You expect betrayal, and so you scan every relationship for signs of it. You expect failure, and so you sabotage your own success before it has the chance to bloom. The tragedy is not only that pain happens, it is that you invite it, recreate it, even when life offers alternatives. The unseen consequences ripple further still. Communities, families, entire cultures inherit unresolved grief. Generations pass down wounds like heirlooms. Children inherit the silent anguish of their parents, the unspoken trauma encoded not only in stories but in nervous systems. Thus, The addiction is not only personal but collective, repeating across history like an echo. Wars, oppressions, cycles of revengeful are amplified by humanity's inability to release its attachment to pain. But do you see the danger here? If left unchallenged, this addiction erodes the very possibility of transformation. You begin to live not as a human being, but as a custodian of old wounds, a curator of sorrows. Life shrinks into a museum of pain, where every exhibit is a memory of what once went wrong. And here we arrive at the critical turning point. If suffering has colonized not only our minds, but our identities, our societies, and even our future, is it even possible to break free? Or are we destined to orbit pain forever, mistaking its gravity for reality itself? This is the precipice, the edge of the cliff. To step forward means rebellion against biology, against culture, against the very identity you've been told is you. Few dare it. But those who do discover something extraordinary, pain need not be a prison. The question, then, is this: how does one escape an addiction that feels like truth itself?